Lurehulk-class Battleship, one of the biggest and strongest ships in the Trade Federation fleet and the Confederate forces. Today, we will take a detailed look at the history and design of the ship. On the scroll bar, we get closer to the first chapter. Fasten your seatbelts and subscribe to the channel. Nordy is with you and we are starting. As is known, Neimoidians and Duros are distant genetic relatives. The Neimoidians were descended from the Duros and inherited many things from them, including shipbuilding traditions. The Durosians were among the first to introduce hyperdrive into the galaxy, reverse engineering the Rakatan heritage in parallel with the Corellians. The Duros ecology fell victim to vassalage of the endless Rakata Empire. Even before the emergence of the Galactic Republic, the Duros already occupied an important position in space politics and entered into intergovernmental treaties, including the participation of the Duros monarchy in the Herglic trade empire. The Herglics, large aquatic mammals from the region of expansion, were known for their ancient skills in flying among the stars. The Duros subsequently became one of the few states that stood at the origins of the Galactic Republic. Led by the legendary Queen Rana Mastrahald, the Duros expanded their influence across the galaxy, establishing new colonies. One of these colonies was Neimoidia, attracted by colonists under the leadership of the Duros traveler and cartographer, Chao Ha'an, also known as Chua Sik Ha'an. Living conditions on Neimoidia differed significantly from those on Duro, presenting an almost resort-like environment compared to the toxic fields and dangerous fauna on the planet Duro. Over the course of thousands of years, the colonists who arrived with Chao Han evolved into a new race, which was then called the Neimoidians. Anatomically, Duros and Neimoidians were almost indistinguishable, but the cultural differences were significant. The Neimoidians and Duros had a bad relationship. The Neimoidians did not particularly like their distant relatives, and the Duros generally despicied them and were very offended when people confused them with each other. We can talk about the Neimoidians as a separate race starting from the 15th millennium before Yavin, that is, before the events of the films. The Duros were the progenitors several other times, but none of them became as famous or as successful as the Neimoidians. But the inhabitants of Neimoidia did not immediately join the galactic trade. Being little known, at first they rarely ventured beyond the boundaries of their few planets. At the same time, Duros could be found in all corners of the galaxy. And it was the Duros who created the Horsch-Kessel Drive Company, which later built the Lucrehulk and other famous ships of megacorporations, which much later formed the Confederacy of Independent Systems, CIS. Horsch-Kessel Drive was a state-owned enterprise of the Duro monarchy. The corporation's headquarters were located on the planet Kessel, as you can see, dozens of light-years from Duro. This once again speaks of the scale of the Duros race. The history of this shipbuilding company goes back thousands of years. Gradually, with increasing influence, the Neimoidians were able to completely buy out the company, receiving everything from drawings and employees to production facilities and patents. The concept of a merchant ship consisting of a control core ship and a massive ring-shaped hold hangar docked with it was developed long before the times of the films. Both Duros and Neimoidians participated in the design of this vehicle. However, the exact date of development of the ship remains unknown. The first Lucrehulk-class vessel known to us, model LH-30I-10, was developed and put into mass production long before the collapse of the Galactic Republic, millennia before the Clone Wars. These ships were already actively exploring star systems. The serial number LH-3010 implies that it was a modification of an earlier design, possibly used to transport cargo and passengers during the New Sith Wars. However, all this remains an assumption for now, since we do not have accurate data about past models of this ship. It is unknown how many ancient LH-3010 bagels survived before the Trade Federation's invasion of the planet Naboo, before the events of the first episode. The only ship of this type known to us rests in the shallow waters of La Marette, a planet in the Outer Ring, in the region of wild space. After its decommissioning, Hugo Barton bought the ship and, having delivered it to the planet, transformed it into a unique city on the water. For hundreds of years, LH-3010 model merchant ships were used exclusively by Neimoidian free traders and their guilds. Paradoxically, other shipping companies showed no interest in these vessels, perhaps because Horsch-Kessel Drive, as during the Separatist crisis, preferred to sell them only to Neimoidians. Over time, free traders, guilds, and corporations had to find common ground and join forces for the benefit of all. Money became their common good. Thus, in the year 350 before the Battle of Yavin, the Trade Federation was founded, growing out of a social agreement between free traders and merchant clans. The ships you are familiar with became the basis of its cargo fleet, which later evolved into a military one. And here a paradox arises, imbued with irony. The Galactic Republic, at the very initial stage, not only did not object, but actively welcomed the emergence of a mega-corporation in the field of trade. In the initial period of the existence of the Trade Federation, the Republic provided it with full support, providing the necessary laws, benefits, and other benefits. No bribes were even required. And the whole point is that in the year 350 before Yavin, before the events described in the 4th episode of the film saga, things in the Republic were going extremely unsatisfactorily. At that time, an era of relative stability and peace had begun in the galaxy, since there were no global wars. The core worlds were fairly quiet, relatively, of course. However, the further away from the galactic capital, the less influence of the central government was felt. There was complete chaos in the outer ring. Where Republican power lost control, pirates and anarchy reigned. This was the era of survival of the fittest. Huge shipping guilds appeared on the outskirts, violating laws, raising tariffs, refusing to share navigation data, attacking competitors, and seizing their cargo. For example, the giant Red Star shipping lines owned entire planetary systems. The Galactic Senate tried to regain control of the outskirts, but for them, it was an impossible task. And at this moment, the Neimoidian guilds and other free traders joined forces, creating the United Trade Federation. This was a real gift of fate for the Republic, a full-fledged trading empire, located in close proximity to the center and potentially controlled by the Senate. The Trade Federation was ready to help solve the problem of returning the borderlands to Republic control for mutual benefit and preventing the uncontrolled enrichment of some states claiming independence. At the very beginning of its existence, the Trade Federation was far from becoming a transport and trade mega-corporation. Initially, it was an alliance of free traders and small transport companies that joined forces to confront the giants of the cargo transportation market. The main goal was to resist the aggressive practices of monopolists and at the same time develop new trade routes, which were then included in navigation maps. At that time, the Trade Federation was far from greedy, willingly sharing navigation data and resolving disputes between traders. The Trade Federation Council actively sought to maintain friendly relations with the market monopolists. However, over time, the leadership of the Trade Federation, where the Neimoidians did not play a dominant role, realized that in the world of trade, a kind word can achieve much less than a kind word and a gun. The organization became firmly structured, with a hierarchy, industry, banks, and even a limited military. Over the 100 years of its existence, the Trade Federation has achieved impressive success. It provided financial support to those in need and used force on those who did not give in voluntarily. Problems on the outskirts of the galaxy have been building up for centuries, and restoration sometimes requires lengthy efforts. Companies such as Pulsar Supertanker, Red Star Shipping Lines, and Roro Transportation were absorbed by the Trade Federation. Other large companies have also felt its impact. It is important to note that in the early decades of its existence, the Trade Federation was an ally of the Galactic Republic, acting in the interests of peace, security, and navigation. The question of creating the armed forces, Army and Navy, became relevant only 100 years after the founding of the Federation. The Trade Federation decided to form a full-fledged military force almost 80 years after its inception, more precisely, in 274 before Yavin. This move was driven by the realization of the need to provide protection for the merchant fleet from aggressive competitors and the rampant pirates whose attacks spanned the outer ring of the galaxy. In conditions where traders, despite their experience, were not professional military men, standard ships did not provide the required level of protection. The Army and Navy of the new military structure in the Trade Federation were simply and clearly called the Trade Defense Force, TDF. From the very beginning, his troops were not the robotic army of droids from the first episode of the movie saga. At first, The TDF was dominated by ordinary officers, soldiers, and sailors. Living beings, not droids. If droids were used, it was in minimal quantities. The first months of the TDF's existence were filled with an intensified fight against piracy and armed crime in various sectors of space. As a result of these efforts, the population perceived the Trade Federation as a source of peace, stability, and prosperity, while the reputation of the Republic became increasingly less favorable. Thus, in many sectors of the galaxy, the Trade Federation has united thousands of companies, attracting them under its wing. Merchants and pirates began to fear ships bearing the Trade Federation emblem. TDF troops received decent salaries, high-quality military training, and modern weapons. They became objects of admiration for many, including talented young men from military dynasties across the galaxy. The TDF often interacted with the judicial forces and the Republic Judicial Department, which strengthened its position as a force capable of ensuring order and justice in the galaxy. Thus, the Trade Federation became not only a powerful economic entity, but also a political force in galactic affairs. It actively invested in the industry of various worlds, participated in charity, and contributed to the research and colonization of new planetary systems. The Federation performed functions that were expected of the Galactic Republic, but which it did not perform under all sorts of pretexts. Even during the Clone Wars, when the Trade Federation had already changed, it remained significant influence, and the Separatists had many supporters willing to fight for it. This was the result of the fact that the Federation, although it had undergone changes, was still associated with order and prosperity. However, the Trade Federation's emergence as an important player in galactic politics began some 120 years before the Battle of Yavin. Around 150 BC, problems began with international trade between the core worlds and the sectors in the middle and outer rings. That is, the previous problems re-emerged. They were resolved by declaring the entire outer ring a free trade zone. At this point, the Trade Federation took advantage of its huge fleet and vast network of hyperspace routes, becoming a monopoly. The Federation has thus secured a huge advantage in the freight market, making other companies uncompetitive. It influenced poorer planets into submission, even if it required coup d'etat. Thus, the Trade Federation used its economic and military power to strengthen its position in the galaxy. Troops were regularly sent to recalcitrant planets, although this was considered a last resort given the high costs of intervention. Billions of credits were spent on bribes with the Senate to ensure that these actions were turned a blind eye. This approach to management was typical of many megacorporations of the time. The Trade Federation acted in accordance with the then savage capitalism, while the Republic remained passive and powerless. With financial resources, trade representatives easily manipulated the votes of senators, lobbying for the passage of bills in their favor. Despite the existence of honest senators whose votes could not be bought, they were subject to blackmail and elimination. Contract killings have been a common and effective method in politics and business. Despite the Trade Federation's atrocities, its reputation remained good, which was on par with taking care of its own wallet. Money played a key role in their approach to management. The Trade Federation actively promoted the colonization of new worlds and organized settlements for the colonists. The poster, created by order of the Ministry of Economic Development of the Republic, promoted active travel and exploration of the Outer Ring. Initiated by several senators and Galactic Senate officials, the campaign served the interests of Trade Federation lobbyists. There was a lot of money behind all this. Federation businessmen have developed a clever way to legally get rich by controlling the recommended hyperspace routes for colonization. The Trade Federation fleet ensured the safety of these routes. Colonial settlements were partially influenced by the Federation, and their establishment was possible only in areas controlled by the Federation. Tariffs and fees for travel along these routes, as well as a significant portion of taxes, went into the treasury of the Trade Federation. The colonists, in turn, spent the money they earned in Federation-owned stores and used only Federation ships to return to their homeland, buying tickets at very high rates. All these conditions were enshrined in the clauses of the bill, which was successfully passed through the Senate thanks to the efforts of Trade Federation lobbyists. Naturally, the process of pushing the document to a high level was accompanied by the introduction of certain sums of money into the pockets of responsible politicians. It is very interesting that the campaign was financed from the Republican budget. Thus, the Neimoidians not only compensated for the costs of bribes from the Republican budget, but also received an additional source of income. It is not surprising that a marketing firm belonging to the Trade Federation, based on the planet Kato Neimoidia, won the tender for the creation of propaganda materials, since the tender was structured in such a way that no other company could simply win it. As a result of this scheme, Republican officials received additional funds that they could spend on luxury goods. Followers of the campaign, inspired by the recommendations, soon realized the difficulties of living under the influence of the Trade Federation. To summarize, the scheme involved the Trade Federation paying Republican senators to approve bills and then winning the bid to create advertising materials using Republican funds. Thus, the Federation was again enriched at the expense of the Republican budget. This cunning scheme is inspired by the true story of the 19th century Wild West, where railroad companies, similar to the Trade Federation, used legal means to expand their influence, build infrastructure, and monopolize markets. With such a grand scale of operations, the Trade Federation became widely known in every corner of the civilized part of the galaxy. Their huge cargo ships were seen almost everywhere. For some, this was a sign of an impending lucrative deal, but for most, especially closer to the time of the Clone Wars, the appearance of greedy traders in orbit was a harbinger of unprofitable contracts or even military intervention. The appearance of the ships of the Trade Federation has remained virtually unchanged for many generations, undergoing only minor modifications to the internal contents. That is why these ships became a symbol of the Trade Federation, firmly ingrained in the collective perception for a long time. At the time of the films, the most popular megatruck model was the LH-3210, which consisted of a ring with holds and hangars, and a spherical control ship LH-1740. We will look at its design in detail in this video. So, the length of the ship was 3,170 meters, width 3,009 meters, and height 1,128 meters, including antennas. In the new canon, the length of the ship is 3,257 meters, the width and height remain the same. The price of the reference LH-3210 was 500 million credits. How much of this we will discuss at the end of the video. Let's look at the structure of a ship, starting with its heart, or rather its head. We are talking about a giant spherical ship, core ship. This core was a complex container ship module capable of functioning as an independent transport and combat vessel with huge holds. Interestingly, it was George Lucas who expressed the desire for the ball in the first episode to resemble the Death Star. The explosion of this ship by young Anakin was intended to reflect Luke's heroic act in the fourth episode, the first in the cinematic saga. Thus, repetition of scenes became a feature of Star Wars long before the arrival of Disney and even before the seventh episode. The height of the ball was 696 meters, and with extended supports and superstructure, 914 meters. The most important equipment was on top of the ship. There were two superstructures on the dome. One of them contained basic communications equipment and some sensory equipment. After the Trade Defense Force began using battle droids primarily, this array of antennas was used to coordinate their actions. Most of the antennas were located on the main body, which will be discussed later. Additional communication antennas were placed inside the body, at the bottom of the sphere. In theory and in the fantasies of the Trade Defense Force's enemies, it was possible to try to block all communications using powerful electronic warfare capabilities. But in practice, it turned out that separatist communications were so well encrypted that this was practically impossible, except in a few isolated cases. The Trade Defense Force and the banking clan, long before the war, worked carefully to create a communication system with strong encryption. Business, as we know, must be able to keep its secrets and reveal others. Thus, what was originally needed for logistics turned out to be extremely useful in wartime. To effectively intercept communications, it was enough to simply hang in the desired sector of space, preferably next to the holonet transmitter, and listen to conversations. During the war, this advanced communications complex made it possible to use the LH-1740 spherical ships as mobile listening stations. One of these ships even appeared in the animated series The Clone Wars under the name Skytop, with additional antennas and scanners hanging in orbit of the second satellite of Ruusan. The number of similar mobile listening stations used by the Separatists remains unknown, but it is known that even the standard LH-1740, without modifications, successfully performed radio interception tasks. And it's worth remembering that similar features were used on Munificent-class frigates, which were discussed in the previous video. The Galactic Republic did not possess such technical means, despite its desire. Instead, the Republic had to make do with stationary listening stations located on planets and asteroids, which, naturally, did not provide such mobility and efficiency as those of Federation ships. The second superstructure of the core ship housed some of the sensors and scanners, the captain's bridge, as well as cabins for senior officers and bridge personnel. This area also contained luxurious quarters for guests, including 50 meeting rooms, one of which was used to welcome unwanted Jedi guests at the beginning of the first episode. Why exactly 50 halls? Indeed, there was a clear excess of them there. Even a dozen of these rooms would be enough to communicate with business partners, competitors, and other business bastards with whom not very honest traders had to deal. The ability to release poisonous gas, as shown in the film, was an emergency measure for emergency situations. And for ordinary visitors, clever, remote-controlled chairs were provided that could both relax the guest with a massage mode and make his stay in the chair extremely uncomfortable. So inconvenient that the unwanted visitor would prefer to quickly end the negotiations and return to his place. In addition, in the rooms, it was possible to regulate gravity, temperature, and humidity, release laughing gases or influence the guest's thoughts, and much more. The ship's treasury was located in the superstructure, which provided customers with the opportunity to pay for delivered goods in cash through precious stones and securities. However, sphere ships sometimes also acted as armored vehicles. The wealth being transported required reliable protection, as well as precautions to prevent possible riots or unauthorized access of lower ranks to the captain's bridge. Blast doors and security droids were used to protect the treasury and prevent unwanted intrusions on the bridge. The doors leading to the captain's bridge were triple, indicating a high level of mistrust, or rather lack of trust, in subordinates outside the bridge. These security measures were taken not only to protect against Jedi with lightsabers and advanced welding skills, but also to ensure internal security from their own crew. The cabins of the officers and bridge staff had a high level of comfort, which was undoubtedly an important aspect. This luxury was not only aimed at taking care of the comfort of the workers, but was also due to the long periods of stay of bridge personnel in this small space. The Neimoidians preferred to spend months in this part of the ship, avoiding going down to the lower decks. Even with such comfort, the Neimoidian officers remained nervous, which was due to the caste mentality of their culture, causing surprise among representatives of other races in the crew. This ship was a kind of space hive, filled with Neimoidians and all the cultural characteristics that came with it. The bridge staff and senior officers constituted a kind of elite, a high caste, considering it unholy to go down to the common engineers and mechanics. The Neimoidians also preferred to remain close to the command bridge for fear that in their absence, one of their colleagues might gain an advantage or begin secret intrigues. Such were their characteristics and morals. Skill in arranging tricks was part of their cultural code. The ship's setup provided everything needed for a comfortable life, including a small hold with high-quality food, water, and water processing facilities, as well as a small wine cellar with fine drinks and much more. Another important detail for the Neimoidians was the ability to leave the superstructure without going down the elevator to the center of the ship, where mere mortals were located. On both sides of the superstructure there was a universal gateway of the Corellian standard, to which shuttles, yachts, and corvettes could dock. In the event of trouble, the ship's crew could quickly leave the superstructure using rescue capsules. Remarkably, however, no means of escape were provided for the remaining crew members, or perhaps this was kept silent in the reference books. In total, during the period of the films, the superstructure housed between 60 and 150 crew members, for a total crew size of 350 to 500. The remainder consisted of 3,000 droids and 200,000 small service droids, representing an impressive level of automation. As human crews were abandoned, droids had to take on more and more responsibilities, freeing the living crew from routine. Below the superstructure, there are many decks. During the period of manning the crew with living beings, it was there that the main crew of several thousand souls lived and worked. Their cabins were also quite comfortable. There were also recreation areas, wardrooms, and even additional meeting rooms. If the ship served as part of the TDF and had a combat mission, Barracks were located on the same decks to accommodate landing troops. The tactical and technical characteristics of the ship included a number of 60,000 paratroopers, but it is unlikely that so many people could fit into the core ship. Most likely, this means 60,000 battle droids. During the Separatist crisis, many of these decks remained empty or were converted into holds. Despite the modularity of the spherical ship's compartments, the interior and exterior were maintained virtually unchanged for a century. The hangar cargo module to which the sphere was docked had practically no cabins, with the exception of several technical rooms for maintenance personnel. During the transition to robotic crews, nothing alive ran outside the sphere. Well, unless he's in an urge, he's so impatient. Usually, only in the spherical ship's core was a breathable atmosphere maintained, and even then, not everywhere. Everything to save money. At the top of the dome, between the belt of cabins and other rooms for ordinary crew members, there were spherical tanks with reactor fuel, a cooling system, and a high-performance supercomputer. Before the LH-1740 was converted into mobile command posts for droid control, supercomputers were much less sophisticated. In those days, the ship did not require this level of computing power. In addition, the ship's computer system, protected by numerous passwords and security systems, stored valuable information. Data repositories included maps of secret hyperspace routes, data on newly discovered planets, and much more. As stated at the beginning of the video, in the early days of the Trade Federation, this data was available for traders to exchange with the Republic and other interested parties in the name of freedom, trade, and exploration. However, over time, it became clear to the Neimoidians that knowledge is money, and then the merchants monopolized their knowledge. Thanks to this data, the Trade Federation monopoly controlled several profitable trade routes, free from gravitational anomalies, black holes, asteroid belts, and planets with strong gravitational influence. This, together with weapons, allowed them to easily change the rules of trade in a particular region. During the war, this data was very useful to the Confederate fleet for outflanking maneuvers and surprise raids on the territory of the Republic. The spaces from the equator of the sphere and below were allocated for vast holds, interconnected by dozens of freight elevators. If the ship had a military purpose, these compartments served to accommodate military equipment, ranging from light airspeeders and lancerspeeders to tanks and heavy combat vehicles. Also, here were the supplies of food, water, medicine, and other things necessary for long space travel, providing the ship with the ability to move continuously for 3 years without visiting a supply base. In the center of the sphere was the heart of the ship, a huge and powerful hypermatter reactor, which provided energy to the entire structure. Even when the main reactor was shut down, or if it was temporarily shut down for maintenance, the crew could rely on the auxiliary reactors. They were less powerful, but sufficient for the basic needs of the ship and crew. If it was necessary to use maximum energy, auxiliary reactors could be activated while the main reactor was running. The Trade Federation could also use spherical ships as mobile reactors. After the war, these ships, which fell into the possession of those who managed to obtain decommissioned or captured LH-1740, were used as mobile nuclear power plants. By landing such a ship on the planet, it was possible to provide energy to a large city, turning the sphere into an analog of a mobile nuclear power plant from the real world. Protective field generators, deflectors, were placed next to the reactor. The deflector projectors were located in special rims, where most of the ship's light guns were also located. Unlike many Star Wars ships, where the protective field generators often extended beyond the edges of the hull, here it was decided to cover all systems under armor protection. Getting to the generator required overcoming thick external armor and breaking through a dozen decks with their floors and bulkheads. Disabling the shield by knocking out the projectors on the rims seemed to be a very difficult task, since there were a fair number of shield projectors, and they were compact. Destroying one sector of the shield was, of course, possible, but knocking down the entire shield, damaging all the projectors, was an almost impossible task. It was easier to try to break through the ship's shield as a whole in the hope that it would finally overload and fail, having exhausted your energy. At the bottom of the sphere there were anti-gravity engines, repulsors, as well as some communication equipment, compartments for landing supports, and other technical equipment. When crewed by Neimoidians, these areas were visited only by repair droids. The Neimoidians did not go into the bottom of the ship even for a big bonus, but if the crew was mixed, then it was possible to do without repair droids. After all, many races do not suffer from such class problems and will easily turn the nuts anywhere, especially for a good bonus and an extra week of vacation. Core ships were full-fledged ships with the ability to land on the surface of the planet. Special landing pits were provided for them, which were demonstrated in the second episode in the Battle of Geonosis. These pits were not just holes in the ground, but were about 450 meters deep and 900 meters wide. However, judging by the film, different landing holes could have different depths. This technological feature was developed by Neimoidian engineers for a reason. Ships such as the core ship were not only valuable, but also extremely expensive to produce and maintain. Maintenance and repair of such large-scale ships required a careful approach and powerful orbital shipyards. And there were fewer such shipyards in the galaxy than the convolutions of the Gamorreans. The main shipyards capable of taking on such tasks were the Kuat shipyards and its subsidiaries at Rotan and Fondor, as well as the Rendili and Karelia shipyards. Since such shipyards were in high demand, their services were expensive, and merchants often had to shell out significant sums for service. Despite the presence of its own repair facilities at the Hirsch-Kessel Drift shipyards, they turned out to be insufficient to service the extensive fleet of the Trade Federation. This meant that traders had to turn to large shipyard owners like Kuat. With the onset of the Separatist crisis, the giant space service on Kuat became inaccessible to future representatives of the CIS, which only worsened the situation. Yes, repairing ships in outer space using repair bots, droids, mechanics, and support ships was possible. But it came with a number of risks and disadvantages. Ships undergoing repairs in outer space became vulnerable to attacks from competitors and pirates. This vulnerability created serious risks for the safety of ships and their crews. Even ships in the shipyard were not completely protected from pirate attacks. There were cases when ships that were at the shipyard received serious damage or were destroyed. One way to minimize risks and ensure the safety of the repair process was to land the ship on the surface of the planet. However, planting the entire Lucrehulk was impractical due to the high costs of equipping mega-powerful repulsors. Then it was decided to make the core ship detachable and launchable. However, in an attempt to save money, the Neimoidians encountered a new problem. The repulsors, exhaust, and cooling systems used were of poor quality and emitted too much radiation. This created a threat to the environment for kilometers around the ship, turning the surrounding area into an area similar to the world from the game Fallout. Landing a ship on a neutral planet was also dangerous, and landing on one's own planet could lead to serious pollution of the ecosystem. The Neimoidians, even being a greedy people, did not want to destroy the environment on their planets, and therefore faced a dilemma in choosing a landing site. Being on the surface, the ship inevitably needs appropriate infrastructure to carry out repair work. Cranes, warehouses, specialized equipment, etc. All these elements are an integral part of the necessary infrastructure. This is how the concept of creating special planting pits intended for maintenance arose. This prominent hole under the ship, with a shallow depth but a respectable total length of 6 kilometers 400 meters, or 4 miles, represented a major element of infrastructure. Here, the radiation emitted by the ship and other harmful emissions were collected and disposed of. An important part of the pits were the gravitational reflectors lining the walls, which not only supported the ship during landing, but also served as a catapult for takeoff. This provided the ship with additional power during takeoff, which was especially important for such a large ship. The pits also provided the maintenance infrastructure, including cranes, elevators, warehouses, etc., that were needed to effectively repair the ship. The presence of all the necessary infrastructure in the pit facilitated and accelerated the processes of loading and unloading the ship, making it more maneuverable and efficient. Also, a grounded ship was easier to defend, which makes sense given its vulnerability during repairs. This created additional security measures and tactical advantages. The epic on Geonosis clearly confirms the above. Upon the arrival of the clone army on this distant planet in defiance of the intergalactic law of the distant galaxy, 60 LH-1740 spherical ships were on the surface. Despite the best efforts of the clone troops, 46 core ships successfully ascended into space and docked with the cargo modules. the clones managed to destroy only 14 ships, mainly due to their location on unprepared sites. Several of these 14 were shot down while docking in orbit. Perhaps the losses would have been even less if Newt Gunray had not delayed permission to take off because of his greed. The chief Neimoidian insisted that the ships be loaded with as many battle droids as possible, realizing that this battle was already lost to the Separatists. Only at a critical moment, when the Republicans approached several ships almost closely, did Gunray give the order to take off. But for some ships it was too late. Several of them were spectacularly disabled by SPHA turbolaser self-propelled guns, knocking out their repulsors with powerful shots. Also on Geonosis, modernization of the landed ships was carried out, with the introduction of additional weapons and improved protection under the leadership of specialists from the Bactoid Corporation. These measures were taken in anticipation of the coming war. Another use for grounded balls was the ability to create mobile headquarters. The placement of such a ship on the planet provided a strong armed base that served as a stronghold for troops, while controlling droids from orbit was more convenient. Sitting on solid ground provided certain safety advantages. In addition, this method made it possible to speed up the landing of troops. Part of the troops landed using rings, while the second part landed with the grounded LH-1740. By the middle of the Clone Wars, droids with some artificial intelligence became widely used without a control station. However, it was preferable to use a control station to ensure better coordination. For those cases where the presence of a supercomputer was still required, mobile control stations were created. The grounded LH-1740 could also function as a ground control post. The range of effective communication with droids, and, consequently, the distance at which they could be effectively controlled, was only 16,000 kilometers. Before the outbreak of the Clone Wars, the Droid Army Control Ship was easily visible due to its features, including 16 antennae on the cargo model and additional ones on the superstructure of the core ship. During the Clone Wars, almost all core warships received similar antennas. Some of the grounded core ships, heavily modified, continued to be used as land bases by the Separatists, even in the final days of the war. On Utapau, in the third episode, such a modified LH-1740 was used, called Unlimited Projection. On board this ship, there was not only a headquarters with a control station, but also a warehouse for spare parts and ammunition, as well as a small factory for the production and repair of droids. Unlimited Projection actively participated in the conquest of Utapau and was present at the surrender of the Pauwans to General Grievous. During the battle, the ship was captured by clones. After the establishment of the Galactic Empire, Unlimited Projection was used as a warehouse by the locals. Later, the Empire returned to this trophy, evicted the locals, and turned the ship into the Emperor's secret treasury. Inside were important artifacts and relics, including General Grievous's personal fighter and the remains of the General's body. Subsequently, this played a key role in the NK Necrosis project. Let me remind you that the core ship, designated LH-1740, was part of the entire assembly, which was called LH-3210. Thanks to this configuration, the Trade Federation's main vehicle was able to transport an impressive volume of varied cargo, reaching a figure of 25 million tons. Let's look at the technical aspects of the ring design, starting at the stern. Here, at the rear of the ship, were located powerful propulsion engines necessary for maneuvering and traction of multi-million weight cargo. The ship's propulsion system consisted of 3 huge Proton 2 propulsion engines and 4 to 6 Proton 12 auxiliary engines. The engines accelerated the ship to 300 mglt, exactly 10 times less than the Venator. Lucrehulk's speed in the atmosphere was 500 km/h. However, the ships tried not to enter the atmosphere, since this required extremely strong strain on the ship's reactors to produce the required amount of energy for the operation of the repulsors. Interestingly, these engines were designed and manufactured by Rendaly Stardrive, the same company that created the majestic Dreadnought-class heavy cruiser, which became best-sellers before the war. During the Clone Wars, Rendaly Stardrive introduced a new generation of battleships, the Victory-class Star Destroyer. Before the Clone Wars, using Rendaly engines did not cause problems. By then, the Republic had already moved away from Rendaly in defense contracts, encouraging the company to turn its attention to the Trade Federation and other megacorporations. As a result, during the Clone Wars, the planet Rendili and its famous shipyards temporarily came under the control of the Confederacy. However, the Grand Army of the Republic quickly expelled the Confederates, denying the Separatists access to critical components needed to build Lucrehulk. It is unclear whether the Separatists were able to organize the production of similar engines themselves, bypassing the Rendili factories, or whether they created their own version. Most likely the first option, given the long-standing use of Rendili engines in the shipbuilding company Horsch-Kessel Drive. These engines have been widely studied and used in ship production, making their structure and processes known. Industrial espionage should also be taken into account, especially with the participation of the Techno-Union, Trade Federation partners, and co-owners of the Horsch-Kessel Drive shipyards. However, problems in engine supplies were still significant. Apparently, if Lucrehulk was built during the war, it was only in limited quantities. Most of the ships that took part in the battles were modified transport ships. More important was the construction of other combat starships. Despite their impressive characteristics, Lucrehulks were not originally combat vessels, but rather were adapted for military purposes. Therefore, priority was given to other ships. The ship had two hyperdrives, the main 2nd class, the reserve 10th class. The Imperial-class Star Destroyer had similar characteristics, except that the Triangle had a Class 8 backup hyperdrive. Thus, in hyperspace, the Separatist Bagel was inferior to the Republican slice of pizza, but flew on equal terms with the Imperial slice of pizza. Huge engines drove two equally huge reactors located at the stern. Combined with the main reactor in the core ship, the result was a very powerful power plant. The use of such a reactor configuration on the semi-civilian Lucrehulk was puzzling, since such systems were usually used on warships, and even then, not always. In fact, the Trade Federation built its ships in advance in the expectation that the Senate would issue a resolution authorizing the installation of powerful military weapons. This assumption was confirmed in further events, which will be discussed below. To avoid wasting space, a protective field generator and the main deflector shield projectors were located next to the engines, creating a two-level protection system. The sphere has the first layer of the shield, the ring, the second. It was rarely possible to penetrate the Lucrehulk's shields without the use of turbo-laser cannons comparable to those of battleships and heavy cruisers, or without the use of powerful anti-ship missiles. Unlike the core ship's shields, the cargo module's deflector was more vulnerable. It could be destroyed by diving under the shield and attacking the generator and main projector with proton torpedoes and bombs. However, due to the thick armor, it would take a significant number of missiles and hits to remove the shield, but this was easier than trying to penetrate the armor. Remember how young Anakin destroyed an entire ship in the first episode? How did this happen? And all for the same reason. Part of the reactor and equipment had to be placed in a hangar, because it couldn't fit anywhere else. And the Lucrehulk power system was designed in such an intricate way that when one block detonated, a chain reaction began. Then, before the Clone Wars, this problem was partially solved by covering what was needed with armored casings, and rebuilding the power system so that there was less chance of this very chain reaction occurring. But this did not completely solve the problem. This is how taking care of the cargo can lead to big problems for the entire ship. The ship's hold was a multi-level system. The main compartment, which we will call a hangar, served for storing large cargo as well as for loading shuttles and barges. Under the long hangar deck there were several levels with holds. During the period of hostilities, these lower levels were used as storage areas for ammunition, weapons, and fuel for the various military equipment carried on board the ship. Communication between the hangar and the lower holds was provided by several freight elevators. In the hangar itself, there were various openwork structures that not only enhanced the strength of the hull, but also cranes were mounted on them to facilitate the loading and unloading process. In addition, the ship always had a sufficient number of loader droids. The hangar was divided into three main zones. The third zone mainly contained military equipment, located near the reactor and engine compartment. The only exceptions were fighters, primarily scarabs and vultures, which were suspended from the ceiling. The idea of hanging fighters from the ceiling, as well as servicing them in this position, so as not to take up deck space and not interfere, was subsequently borrowed by the Galactic Empire. Star Destroyers and many other carrier ships carried the iconic TIE Fighters, TIE Interceptors, and other TIE equipment. To move from the hold of one section of the ship to another, Exclusively technical decks located in the reactor area were used. However, even droids rarely used these passages. Live crew generally avoided working in the hold, especially since most of the Lucrehulk were equipped with droids. Each of the 3 sections of the hangar could be divided by sliding bulkheads as needed, forming several separate compartments. In addition, all 3 main hangar areas were separated by massive armored blast doors, so strong that even a tank's cannon would take a long time to penetrate them. All this was done to ensure the safety of the cargo. The more valuable the cargo, the farther from the hangar exit it was located. In the history of the Trade Federation, there were cases when pirates robbed Lucrehulk right in outer space. Near the hangar's exit, protruding structures housed generators and projectors of powerful tractor beams, as well as automatic systems that made it easier for larger vessels to dock or board inside the hangar. This entrance to the hangar was controlled automatically, even for an experienced cargo ship pilot who could make a mistake during maneuvering. Therefore, the use of automation during landing was mandatory for everyone. During the war, this was actively used by the C-99-79 landing boats. The world of Star Wars has its own peculiarities of the cargo transportation system. Small cargo ships typically load on planetary surfaces at spaceports. Larger ships are often loaded at orbital cargo stations, which serve as intermediate depots. Cargoes are delivered there by shuttles from the surface of the planet or cargo ships from other planets. In the case of orbital stations, cargo ships often enter their massive hangars, or, if their size does not allow this, dock with the stations in outer space. However, Lucrehulk stands out from the pack. Due to its size, it is incapable of landing on the surface of the planet. This leads to 2 possible solutions to this problem. The first involves the constant transport of cargo shuttles and light transports between the ship and the planet's surface. The second option involves docking Lucrehulk directly with the orbital station using its bulky docking mechanisms. These mechanisms, which are a kind of paws or claws, are specially designed for this purpose. Federation space stations were equipped with special docking ports for this type of operation. However, in most cases, not all stations were equipped to dock directly with Lucrehulk, resulting in lengthy and complex loading and unloading processes. In such cases, the ship spent a lot of time in orbit, waiting for the cargo shuttles to carry out their tasks. In some cases, if the planet was not very rich, cargo containers could be dropped into orbit and then lifted inward, using tractor beams. The unloading process had a similar scenario. Massive cargo containers simply approached the hangar's exit and were then driven out using tractor beams, which in this case could be called repulsion beams. To increase the efficiency of this process, 4 to 6 additional hangar entrances were provided, each leading to a different hangar area. The number of these inputs could vary depending on the series and modification of the Lucrehulk, given the numerous variations of ships of this type built in different periods. In peacetime, the internal hangars were used to receive light cargo ships and shuttles, while in wartime they could serve as a launching point for fighter aircraft. This ensured a faster launch of fighters, the takeoff of which was partially covered by the armored hull of the ship. This method also provided additional security, since the main hangar entrance could be vulnerable to enemy attacks, which could damage the hold or even lead to boarding. Some modifications of Lucrehulk lacked additional hangar entrances. In peacetime, interior hangar entrances were used when the main entrances were closed. The main hangar doors were also lockable and had beam projectors to keep the atmosphere in. But the use of life support in the hangar was rare, especially during combat when the ship had already sent the bulk of its Mosquito fleet into space. The ship's hangars housed an extensive group of unmanned spacecraft. According to technical specifications, the Lucrehulk could accommodate up to 1,500 droid fighters or bombers. In practice, such a large number of droids represented a huge cost, both financially and militarily. Training pilots and maintaining so many droids required significant resources. However, in addition to financial aspects, there were also practical limitations. Launching such a large-scale Mosquito fleet required a lot of time, and the flight time of the Vultures was limited to only 35 minutes. This meant that even if the hangars were filled with a full complement of droids, the ship could not fully deploy the space group before the first drones returned to refuel. In light of these factors, the Neimoidians, as intelligent beings, did not overstaff hangars. Instead of loading the ship until it was fully loaded with fighters, they limited the number of droids to a more efficient number, This prevented wastage of resources and minimized losses in the event of an attack, also avoiding the unfortunate consequences of destroying Lucrehulk with a full space group. Lucrehulk could deploy and send 1,000 aircraft into battle in a matter of minutes. This speed was also ensured by the fact that droid fighters required much less time to prepare for takeoff, and the takeoff itself. This agility in deploying combat aircraft made the Lucrehulk a powerful force in space battles. Even a mixed force of unmanned and manned fighters could quickly respond to threats and provide support in the event of an attack. To transport the transported robotic troops, there were dozens of shuttles and landing craft in the hangar. Basically, it was 50 S-99-79 ships. Despite the huge wingspan, almost the entire width of the hangar, these landing craft did not make work in the hangar difficult. The wings of the Si-99-79 could be detached in a few minutes and folded compactly in a suitable location. In addition, there is plenty of space under the ship's wings for tanks, armored personnel carriers, and droid loaders to move containers without hindrance. The troops transported were 6,250 AAT tanks, 550 MTT armored personnel carriers, 1,500 unarmored transporters and land speeders, an unspecified number of air speeders, and 329,600 B1, B2 series battle droids and droidicas. And there was still room for 4 million tons of cargo. But here it's the same as in the case of fighter jets. A full load was almost never encountered. The Confederate tank fleet was always diverse, but not so numerous as to load 6,000 tanks and 1,000 armored personnel carriers for each combat dealer. During the Clone Wars, Lucrehulk was sometimes loaded with up to 500,000 droid infantry, a group of 500,000 droids, several hundred tanks, and hundreds of heavy droid walkers. Here's the recipe for victory. The landing of such a huge army could be carried out quickly with the help of several dozen landing craft, providing impressive military power. Even clones could be frightened by such power. Trade Federation ships have always carried significant quantities of ground equipment and droids to combat pirates and competitors. During the invasion of Naboo and the Clone Wars, each Lucrehulk carried an impressive number of droids. Republic military strategists confidently classified these ships as large landing ships, or heavy aircraft carriers, while the Separatists insisted on their classification as battleships. First of all, because of the ship's armament. The Rusan Reformation made noticeable adjustments to the construction of warships and the armament of transport workers. To comply with the law, Trade Federation ships initially carried only light laser cannons to combat the Mosquito fleet and small pirate ships. Thus, transport ships, which were not subject to size restrictions, were only allowed to have light laser guns. Therefore, the Neimoidians decided to install a huge number of light cannons on Lucrehulk, many of which were only formally light. In the case of the later version of the ship shown in Episode 1, that is the LH-3210 model, the arsenal was like this: 112 laser cannons and 28 4-gun turrets on the cargo module, and 280 light laser cannons on the core ship. Such an arsenal was usually enough to fend off most pirate gangs, who used mainly fighters, bombers, and light-armed transports. The core ship's cannons were mainly located in the rims, next to the deflector projectors and next to the antennas and locators, and the 4-gun turrets were placed on the sides of the hull and in the aft part above the reactor. This was the original composition of all Lucrehulk weapons. Shortly before the invasion of Naboo and the subsequent outbreak of the Separatist crisis, the leadership of the Trade Federation, contrary to the laws of the Republic, decided to begin rearmament of their armed forces. By the way, the corporation's Directorate then consisted of 7 members, among whom only one was a Neimoidian, new to Gunrai. The modernization of the Lucrehulk included the installation of new turbolaser cannons, 168 barrels and 42 4-gun turrets. Such an arsenal may seem excessive. In total, more than 500 barrels of different calibers. However, the configuration of the turrets and the shape of the ship play an important role here. Turbolasers were scattered along the edges of the entire ring-shaped body, so no more than a third of all barrels could fire in one direction. However, fire from 50 turbolasers also posed a serious threat. But this arrangement allowed the battleships to fire in all directions at once, also shooting through the interior of the cargo module, providing protection from enemy spacecraft. Modernized Lucrehulks in the Federation and later Confederate navies began to be classified as battleships. During the Sith intrigues 33 years before the Battle of Yavin, during the trade summit on Eriadu, as a result of the conspiracy and murder of 5 of the 7 members of the Federation Directorate, Newt Gunray received almost complete power in the company, appointing his Neimoidian supporters to leading positions. At this point, 10% of all Lucrehulks had upgraded weapons. But by the time of the invasion of Naboo in 32 BC, about 32% of container ships had been modernized. By that time, the program of equipping the Trade Defense Force with battle droids had already been going on for several years, which took on even greater momentum after Gunray came to power. The exact percentage of LH-3010s upgraded by the start of the Clone Wars is unknown, as is the exact number of ships built. It is mentioned that there were thousands of them. It is unlikely that their number was more than 5,000 to 7,000, given the enormous cost of building and maintaining the ship. It can be assumed that about 50% of all Lurehulk-class were rearmed. In terms of its role in battles, the LH-3010 was something between a landing assault ship and a spacecraft carrier. Its analog in the real world can be the Wasp-class amphibious assault ship and the like. The Separatists invested heavily in the development and use of a Mosquito fleet, including fighters and bombers. Lucrehulk, let me remind you, had the ability to transport up to 1,500 such devices, although usually there were several hundred on board, and this entire swarm of fighters could fly into battle in a matter of minutes. Also, Vulture-class droid starfighter and Hyena-class droid bombers could transform into walker mode and remain on the ship's hull. In this mode, they waited for commands without consuming fuel and could take off instantly when necessary. The point is that if a threat arose, this entire air group could instantly engage in combat. While the Republicans wasted time launching their manned fighters, Lucrehulk was already able to mobilize its powerful space group. The presence of a large number of landing ships on board made it possible to very quickly land troops on planets, much faster than the Republic Acclamator-class assault ship. Thus, Lucrehulk performed excellently in the role of an aircraft carrier and landing ship. However, it also showed excellent performance in linear squadron combat. Although it was not the most powerful serial combat starship of the Confederacy of Independent Systems, it was the most massive serial battleship of the Separatists. Thanks to their excellent communications systems, LH-3010s were often the flagship of large CIS naval formations. Most often, these ships carried out a blockade of besieged planets. And so what? The traders knew how to organize blockades like few others. In the old days, long before the war, sometimes just one single dealer with a space group on board was enough to block a civilized planet for many years. Naturally, with timely replenishment of the blockading ship with fuel, food, etc. Thus, long before the war, the frightening silhouette of the money dealer instilled fear in both enemies and those who were in debt, luring them out of their last credit reserves. Victims were rarely able to predict whether a ship was armed with heavy weapons or was simply a transport ship, and when the ersatz battleship opened fire, it was already too late. An example of a blockade in which Lucrehulk participated was the battle for the strategically important planet Christophsis. At least 12 ships of this class took part in this battle. Even against one bagel, it was worth engaging in a duel, having at least 2 flying pieces of pizza. Star destroyers such as the Venator or Victory. By the way, for 500 million credits, which one LH-3010 cost, you could buy 8 Venator-class and recruit fighters for surrender. Thus, from the point of view of military expediency, the Venators, and even the Imperials, which cost 150 million per ship, were much more effective. However, given the Lucrehulk's original role as a truck and its enormous cargo-carrying capabilities, the ship justifies such a high price tag. Despite the poor weapon distribution, the LH-3010's gun count was so large and the ship's reactors so powerful that the Separatist ship could easily handle Republic Star destroyers. Many Republic admirals and captains died underestimating the potential of the armored transport. Given enough fighters and adequate support from frigates and corvettes, the Lucrehulk posed a serious threat. Attacking the upgraded Lucrehulk was extremely risky, especially for pirates. Fortunately for Republicans, the use of LH-3010 was not widespread. In the decisive battle of the entire war, the Battle of Coruscant, there were dozens of them, most likely about 50 ships. This represented a relatively small portion of the overall CIS fleet centered around the capital, consisting of thousands of different ships. During the war, not only the powerfully armed LH-3010, which were proudly called battleships, took part in battles. Weakly armed transport personnel also took part in the battle, retaining weapons from the pre-Nabooan period. Also, for military operations, core ships were used that were not equipped with a hangar cargo ring module. For example, at the beginning of the war, in the year 22 before Yavin, the Hyena mothership, converted into a scientific vessel, evacuated a secret laboratory involved in the development of chemical weapons from the planet Queta. 2 years later, in the year 20, an extremely toxic defoliant was created and began to be produced on board Hyena. They decided to test the new chemical weapon on the planet Naboo. However, Republic intelligence became aware of the impending attack, and on its way to Naboo, Hyena was intercepted over the planet Hanogre by a Republic acclamator. This scientific vessel turned out to be a serious opponent for the acclamator. In the ensuing battle in orbit and then in Hanogre's atmosphere, both ships were heavily damaged and Hyena crashed to the surface. The defoliant tanks on board depressurized, causing an environmental disaster on the entire planet. The Republic ship was able to rise from the atmosphere back into orbit, but its damage was so severe that its crew had to abandon it. In mid-Yavin 19, 2 modified LH-1740s were sent to support Separatist sympathizers during the Rendili Fleet crisis. These combat variants, equipped with powerful weapons and a space group of droid fighters, met in battle with 2 acclamator ships at Rendili. These acclamators, called Triumph and Donut, were seriously damaged. However, the outcome of the battle remained in doubt until the Republicans came to the aid of support in the form of 5 dreadnoughts of the Rendili fleet and a 3rd acclamator. As a result of this unequal battle, the Confederate ships were destroyed. After the famous events on Mustafar and the death of Newt Gunray, the leadership of the Trade Federation passed to Centipeth Fendos. Soon, on Cato Neimoidia, at Blaster Point, an agreement was signed, according to which the Trade Federation transferred all its assets, all its weapons, all ships to the Galactic Empire. The Trade Federation continued to exist, but only as a state-owned trade and transport company under the supervision of the Imperial Senate. Thus, the majority of all Lucrehulk fell into the possession of the Empire. The LH-3010 did not fit into the military doctrine of the newly formed Empire, so most of the ships were sold or transferred to large shipping companies, wealthy rogue traders, and the corporate sector, a kind of semi-autonomy within the Galactic Empire. However, the Empire itself used donut ships, albeit very rarely. Some Lucrehulk were transferred to the Imperial Flight Academies and were used as a mobile training center to train future aces of the Imperial Navy. The huge ship hangars greatly contributed to this. In the early years of its existence, the Empire used the LH-3010 for its intended purpose, as container ships and cargo ships. The Bagels provided logistics for the vast growing Imperial state, establishing outposts on distant worlds and plying long supply lines. However, by the beginning of the Galactic Civil War, there is no mention of such use of Lucrehulk. Subsequently, many LH-3010 were delivered to scrap planets and dismantled for recycling into metal and further use as recyclable materials. Naturally, there were also illegal owners of Lucrehulk, but there were very few of them, since due to the high cost of the ship to maintain, few could afford to have such a vessel. For the same reason, black market traders who were lucky enough to get their hands on an expensive bagel tried to sell it as quickly as possible, setting an average price of just 40 million credits. In the years following the Clone Wars, many Lucrehulk continued to fight the newly formed Empire under the banner of the former Confederacy, now called Separatist Remnants. 2 years before the 17th year before the Battle of Yavin, the remnants of the Confederation in the Middle and Outer Rim were almost completely destroyed, and the conflict ended in victory for the Empire, going down in history as the reconquest of the Rim. The few Separatists who survived these events, along with their ships, including LH-3010, entered the Rebel Alliance, formed in the 2nd year before the Battle of Yavin. Due to the reckless actions of the Alliance leadership, most of the ships were lost in open battles with the mighty Imperial fleet. By the way, the rebels also used the LH-3010 they inherited as mobile training centers. For example, a ship called Lucrehulk Prime, commanded by Hera Syndulla herself. But unlike similar Imperial ships, the Rebel Training Center was a permanent place of residence for cadets and was highly valued due to its mobility since it was a full-fledged ship, unlike most ordinary training centers. And if necessary, he could hide in hyperspace from danger. Another interesting use of Lucrehulk, or rather LH-1740 core ships, is also known. All Dr. Aphra comic series feature the Haifa Base 1 space station. It was used by a secret Imperial research unit to develop new weapons and droids. The project manager was the well-known Tarkin. The huge station consisted of 7 LH-1740 sphere ships. The station did not last long. Shortly after the Battle of Yavin, the station was destroyed as a result of rebel sabotage. A number of ships, probably several hundred, survived the Galactic Civil War, which ended in 19 after Yavin. But the battle story of Lucrehulk did not end there. Bagel still managed to fight in a number of major conflicts, for example in the Darknest Crisis in 35-36 years after Yavin, also known as the Swarm War. Thus, the history of the Lucrehulk class goes back thousands of years. It was this ship that became a symbol of the power of the Trade Federation, and during the war, the most popular CIS battleship. He was the best argument during trade negotiations, and his appearance inspired fear in the hearts of enemies.